Hi folks, welcome to the next in our series on developing with Next.js and Headless CMS. Today we're going to talk about caching, which is a really big part of performance. We want to build really high performing websites and we don't want to put too much load on the APIs that our websites calls. And one of the APIs that we're going to be calling is our Headless CMS. That is literally what a Headless CMS is. It's a content API, but we might have other APIs that we're calling as well. So let's take a look at how Next.js does caching and a little refresher on how we can make that work for us. Let's dig into a diagram to look at it. So in this picture of our system, we've got everything centering around what I'm calling the origin server. This is where your code is actually going to run. And when you deploy a Next.js website on a Netlify or a Vercel, it actually is going to use a serverless function, a serverless resource to make that work. You can also deploy a Next.js site on something like a virtual machine using Docker. There's all kinds of ways you can deploy it, but your code is going to run at something called the origin for the most part. But your middleware, if you're deploying Netlify or Vercel, is going to run at the edge, and you're going to have another layer there that runs before the origin, okay? So it can get a little confusing sometimes of where your code is running, but for the most part, if you're calling fetch and you're pulling content from an API or you're pulling data from an API, you're using fetch almost always. And so Next.js has something called the fetch cache, which if we're in preview mode, we want to pretty much disable that for the most part. And then if we're working in production mode, we want to cache as optimally as possible, and we want to be able to invalidate that cache as well. So we're going to show you how to do that. Next.js also caches the full route. So if I'm at /about us or /contact us, that's the route, the path that I see in the browser or what gets passed into like my get page function, so that we can cache based on that route. And that's a whole nother level, because I might call a bunch of fetch calls that build up all the data I need for the route, and then I cache the route itself. And that can be cached at the origin server. But then we can also use another technique called stale while revalidate to cache at the CDN level. And this is a little trickier, and I'll show you some ways to validate that this is actually working. But what happens is when you have, the CDN is all over the world. You're going to have different, we call them POPs, or lots of different nodes that can be globally, right? And with SWR, with stale while revalidate, that means that we're going to serve stale content while a single request per path goes home to the origin from that server node to get the new data for that path, return it back to the CDN, and now we can start serving the updated version of that page or that path. So with the CDN caching, we can get super high performance, because if I'm in the Philippines or if I'm in Australia or if I'm in the US or Canada, wherever I am globally, it's going to use the closest POP to me, the closest CDN node to get that. And then it'll only call home when it needs to update that. So we want to optimize this as much as possible. And one of the techniques that I'm going to show is having what's a fairly long cache timeout for all three of these levels, so that we can make sure that we're going to be serving as much cached content as possible, but then we're going to also add something called a webhook. So what we can do is from the API itself, in this case the API is going to be our CMS, we're going to be using Agility CMS, we can actually send a message to the origin server. Let's actually draw this in as a webhook. And what that is going to do is it's going to invalidate cache. And we can invalidate cache for a whole route, or just for one. We can use what's called a tag or a key for the fetch portion of that cache. And so we can do a lot of different things to make sure that we're calling home as little as possible to get the most up-to-date information. Now let's dig into the code and see how all this works. All right, so I've zoomed in on the code quite a bit here so you can read exactly what's happening. What we want to do is we want to build a layer into our code where all of our data access is going to happen through fetch or through SDKs that themselves call fetch, so that we can clarify exactly how we're accessing this content or this data through APIs, so we can be very clear about how the cache is going to work. So I'm going to look first in our main slug page that we've got. Now, because Agility has routing built into it, we're going to use only one slug for all of our pages, which we don't have to do, but this is how this diagram is set up, or this setup is working, okay? So we're going to call get Agility page. That is actually going to call into the Agility SDK, right? So we're using the Agility Next.js SDK. We're going to call get Agility page props. this call has caching built into it. Right, so it already has the logic built into it to do so if I'm in preview mode, so if I pass preview equals true into this, it's not going to cache at all. But I'm also setting content link depth equals 0. What this means for the Next.js SDK is I'm only going to get the page. I'm not going to get any linked content or components from that page. Just going to get the page object itself that comes back. And then for every component that I'm loading data for, that component needs to do its own data loading. Let's look at one of those components. All right, so the simplest component is our rich text component. Let's look at how that works. So we're actually classifying these components as unloaded module props, which means when someone called getPage, we called it with get depth 0. That means I can cache the page independently of the components, so that if I change a component on the page, which happens a lot, if I just change some text that's in there, I don't have to go get all the other components on that page and the page again. It makes it a lot more efficient in terms of caching to get the content. Okay, so we're going to call getContentItem in here because each component is a content item. And this call is actually going through our little library that we've written. I put it in a lib folder, all right? So let's look at that call. So we're getting the Agility SDK and we're setting the fetch config. And a lot of SDKs are now exposing this so that you can pass some Next.js parameters into our fetch calls that are going to be made. And this is kind of a controversial thing that the Next.js team did, but it works really well because it means anytime we're calling fetch, we can do caching. Now, having used .NET and a few other systems for caching, I think I'd like to have a little bit different library to do that. And Next.js is expanding this. There's a whole new tag called use cache that you can start adding. It looks something like this. That's sort of a little more controversial as well because it's a totally new paradigm. I'm not going to be looking at use cache right now. We're just going to look at the fetch config. So there's two ways that you can determine sort of how you want to invalidate or key up your cache keys, right? And we're going to use tags for one of them. You can use the full route path or can use a tag, right? So for each piece of content, we know that it is a content ID and it's based on a locale or a language code, okay? So when I get a single content item, I'll be able to tell if that content item changes. Why do I know that? Because when Agility changes a piece of content, and this happens with most CMSs, I can use a webhook to fire an event in my origin server that will then invalidate that content, that will remove it from cache, all right? And we're also going to set a revalidate time of 60 seconds on here. So this means that we will only ever try to go back to the server in cases, even if it's still in cache, I'll go back to the server every 60 seconds to do that. And we could make a longer timeout for this if we wanted to. We could make it a day. What this means is that for whatever reason, if the webhook fails, then at the most, you're going to have content that's out of date for only 1 minute. So this is just a decision that you get to make, this revalidate. And there's a couple other revalidate timeouts that we're going to be looking at. But what we've done is we've wrapped our getContentItem call to do this. And we've done this with a bunch of content, okay? A bunch of content calls. Our getContentList call, we've done exactly the same thing, except this time, when we get a content list in Agility, we actually use the reference name of that list. So we're gonna build a tag based on the reference name and either the language code or the locale code. These are sort of either one could be used here, right? So we're gonna have a tag that we can revalidate this on, okay? So what this means is that when I get a list of content, I can anytime an item is changed in that list, I'm going to get it revalidated, okay? Let's look at how that revalidation actually works. What we've done is we've added in this, in the API folder, there's a revalidate route that we have here. And what we're going to get is a revalidate request coming from Agility that tells us what piece of content or page has been is being cleared out, has been changed, okay? Now we're only caring about published at this time because we're not going to cache at all if we're in preview mode. If we're in preview mode, we're always going to go get the latest item from the server. And there's not as much of a problem with preview mode having high performance either, right? Although you could change that logic if you needed to. But in this case, we're going to only worry about revalidating things in published mode. So if we have a reference name on here, this means this is a piece of content. What we're going to do is build the key for if it was a list. So we're going to use the reference name of whatever was changed, or we're also going to invalidate a single content item. So we're just kind of do a brute force here. We're going to revalidate 2 tags. And when you're looking at hosting for Next.js, you want to make sure that the revalidate tag This is coming from the Next.js Cache SDK. You want to make sure that that is implemented. And we can do a revalidate tag, or we can also do a revalidate path. And we can get a little bit deeper on that maybe in another video. But in this case, we're going to use revalidate tag. So we're going to actually invalidate the cache at the fetch level. And what's cool is Next.js actually keeps a dependency here in how this works, so that anytime I revalidate a tag that's been used on a route, that whole route gets invalidated as well. So even if I just change one little piece of content on my page, maybe it be a component or a piece of content that component also loads in, that whole dependency tree is maintained by Next.js so that the page gets immediately invalidated. And we can show how this works in a second. But this is essentially how the caching works at the object level through fetch, right? Now remember, we talked about route level caching as well. Let's go back to our page to see about that. So we've got some exports on here, and one of the exports that we've done is revalidate. So you can export a constant revalidate. This is just a number that basically says how long do we want to keep this entire route in cache. And that route is going to be based on whatever the path is that gets sent into here. So whatever these params are that get passed to the page. I hesitate to say, I think I mentioned earlier, that's usually what's in the browser. We could be actually doing a rewrite from middleware that changes this. So there might be cases where what's in the browser isn't exactly what is in the params that get passed into your page component. But for the most part, it's going to be the path that is being routed here. That's the key, right? So we can do that. Now there's another layer we can add onto this as well. And for that one, we want to say, how is this cached at the CDN? We want to set up that stale while revalidate. Where is that done? That's done in your next config, okay? So we'll have to add that into here. And give me a second, I'm going to actually jump out to the Next.js docs and come back and to remind you what that is. All right, so if we jump to the Next.js docs, we can see that we want to customize the stale while revalidate expire time for CDNs, okay? Now, the reason I had to look this up is this value actually changed between Next.js 14 and 15, and our code example is based on Next.js 15. So we can actually set what's called the expire time in our next config to configure how long we want something to cache on the CDN before it calls home, right? So we can set that here. We can set that to 1 hour. And what this means is that every hour, what's cached on the CDN for a route is going to be cleared out. It's going to call home more often than that, but it's going to keep it in cache for at least an hour. So you might get, if you have a site that's really slow, you might have some out-of-date content, or if you don't invalidate your cache properly. But for the most part, you want to be able to sort of balance all these, and we want to be able to test that our caching is actually working properly. So I'm going to set this expire time here at 1 hour, and I'm going to check in any changes that I've done here, and we're going to actually test this out on the server. So we'll see you back in a second. I'm going to get all this set up on the server to make sure that it's working, and we'll demonstrate it with a webhook. Okay, so running this locally, we can actually test out how this is going to work before we deploy it, just to make sure that we've got things set up correctly. All right, so I've done a next start command. So I ran npm run start or yarn start after doing a build. And then let's look at what localhost 3000 is showing us, okay? So if we refresh this and we look at under the way to look this under your network, you can just filter by doc and it'll just show you the main route. And then if we look at the response headers that come back, our cache control is the most important one for how we're going to cache on our CDN. And you can see we've got two values that are in here. We've got our server max age, which is 60. So that's the expires from the page itself. We're going to, every 60 seconds, it's going to check for a new version of this page on the origin server, but it's going to keep the stale version, potentially stale version of this page in cache for 3,540 seconds. Okay, so that's that setup that we've got. So those are the two values that we're kind of playing with, is our expires time, which is the stale while revalidate time, and the server max age, which is the expires from the page. So it's a little bit confusing because they're both kind of expiries in a way. But if this is working, then we know that we're going to get some actual caching. Now let's look on the actual server itself, okay? So I'm switching browsers here to kind of keep things clear for myself. So what I did is I actually, from the Agility Web Studio, I switched to live mode, and then I clicked open a new window. So I know that I'm viewing published content right here. Right, so this is the live version. I'm not in preview mode, and I'm going to refresh this. And what we want to make sure is sometimes you have to do a couple refreshes to get this. You want to make sure that you're actually getting hits, okay, from your server. And almost every CDN will tell you whether it was a hit or what's called a miss. A hit is where it was served directly from cache and everything is hunky-dory. It means we're going super fast and this is as good as it gets, right? If it's a miss, it means we had to call home. And you will get a miss every once in a while. You will also sometimes get what's called a stale version of the page. That means that we were calling home, but we're waiting for that call home to finish and to return us new data before we get that. So there's a bunch of different values that could happen there. Now, let's set up our actual revalidate webhook to make sure this all works in terms of invalidating things immediately, okay? So if we just remember, we've got this revalidate route that we've got here, right? So let's look at that. Under our app/API revalidate. So if we actually set our webhook to hit API/revalidate, we should be good to go. So let's set that up in our CMS. So in Agility, the webhooks are under settings, under development, and we're going to add a new webhook. I'm going to copy this part of the URL here. So we're going to call this revalidate on Vercel. And our path is API/revalidate. And we want this for content publish events. Let's enable this, and let's go ahead and create this webhook. All right, so that's set up now. So what we want to do is actually test to make sure this works, okay? So we can see we'll refresh here and the content isn't changing. What we want to make sure that we get to is where we can update some content and it will change immediately once we publish it, okay? So now we can do a couple different things here. We can actually switch back and forth to make sure this is working in preview mode and not caching, and then make sure that it's working in live mode. So I'm just going to put a word edit here. I'll save that. And let's actually just preview this in Web Studio. And in Web Studio, by default, you're in preview mode all the time, and we can see we've got our edit here. But if we're over here, now, because this is using cookies, I'm going to actually switch browsers so that I make sure that I'm not in preview mode, okay? All right, so I'm viewing published content over here, all right? So that's all good. Let's bring up the network again and make sure we're getting hits on this, right? So here we go. We're getting a hit. Awesome. Switch back to our Edge browser, which has preview mode, and let's actually publish this change. I'm not publishing the whole page. I'm just publishing a component on that page. All right, so let's wait for that to go through. This is going to process, and it's going to update our API, and it's going to fire off. It's going to clear everything on CDNs. It's going to fire off webhooks. It's doing all kinds of stuff. And so there you go. So that's done now. Right, so I should be able to refresh over to here, switch back to Chrome and remove this. I'm hoping I get a miss on this now. All right. Sometimes it takes a couple seconds. Sometimes it takes 2 requests because see, we've got this stale version, right? And I refresh again. Now I see my updated content, and this should be, if I look at it, hang on, where's my response header? Pardon me. Response header's here, and it's a hit, okay? So the stale will revalidate is totally working with that, and it means that I didn't have to wait 60 seconds for my cache to get cleared out, but I still was able to serve a very high performance version of the page until the origin server was actually able to deliver that to the CDN. So there's a bunch of different things that are going on there, but that is a high level overview of how caching works in Next.js with Headless CMS. Thanks very much, and we'll see some more later.